Well, Australia's property market is going through some extremes at the moment. On one side of the country, we're seeing some record growth. I'm talking about the eastern seaboard, while on the other side, they're struggling in a post-boom era.
And with interest rates at a record low, many are wondering what's next. Well, to discuss the year ahead for the property market, we're joined now by Dr. Andrew Wilson from Domain. Good morning to you. And you were even just revealing a little earlier that actually auctions and properties are on the market.
Yes,
Christmas Eve even. People are just still getting out there, but it's becoming increasingly challenging for a lot of people, particularly on the eastern seaboard.
Absolutely.
What's your view of where the market is heading in the year to come? Are we going to continue to see that rise in property values, the struggle for people to be able to save enough to even put a deposit down?
Well, I think more of the same next year, Miriam, and it will be, as you say, the dichotomy between the East Coast and the West Coast. Certainly Sydney is still a very strong market, and Melbourne, of course, and that's really the same situation as last year. Moderate prices growth in the smaller capital city markets, but Sydney keeps charging ahead, and so does Melbourne, and I guess that's good news for property owners. But if you're a first home buyer, particularly in that Sydney market, the challenges just keep on going. And I think next year we will get more prices growth, but not at the same level as we've had over the last couple of years.
Yeah, Andrew, I'm interested to hear you say you think more of the same for next year. Given that many economists are forecasting perhaps one or two rate rises, would that not really put a damper on price growth?
Well, absolutely, and there's no doubt that the relationship between interest rate movements and house price growth is very accurate, and I'm not sure we'll see interest rate rises from the Reserve Bank next year. Of course, remember, we've got that halfway mark towards the recession bogey next year already in track, but I think that we are starting to see out-of-cycle rises from the banks. I think that'll continue next year with this low interest rate environment. Profits are being squeezed by the banks, struggle to get deposits, of course, with these very low deposit rates. And I think we will see rates rise irrespective of what happens with the Reserve Bank.
Not just for investor loans, but you think for owner-occupiers as well?
Well, this is the issue that we have next year, which is the challenge for our financial sector, is that with low interest rates, record low interest rates, there's this constraint on profits. And, of course, banks have a responsibility to their shareholders. And I think that's why we've already started to see these out-of-cycle increases in mortgage rates. I think that it's would be problematic for the Reserve Bank to be raising rates, particularly given we still clearly have an underperforming economy, and particularly in those resource states, Western Australia and Queensland. I think the last thing they'd be looking for would be higher interest rates. So I think the balance would be between steady rates and maybe another cut or two next year. The question is whether they'd be passed on.
What might it mean also in terms of, for those people who have just struggled to get into the market, mortgage stress, once we start to see interest rates tracking up, repaying those mortgages?
Well, look, the relationship between mortgage stress and interest rates reflects also what's happening in the local economy. And it's no coincidence that the Melbourne and Sydney economies are certainly, the Sydney economy particularly is the strongest in the country. And Melbourne's also doing quite well. And I think we had a shakeout in the economic environment in those markets, particularly where there has been strong growth. Then we start to see higher levels of mortgage stress. But the levels at the moment really are at low levels and restricted to those areas, of course, where the economy is struggling, and that is the Western Australian markets and to some degree the Central Queensland markets.
It's well known just how unaffordable a lot of housing is across the country at the moment. Do you see any relief there? Perhaps if we look at the apartments, we've got an oversupply in some cities. Do you feel as though that will lead to some relief as far as prices are concerned, allowing people to get into the market?
Well, Sydney's the issue here in terms of affordability and particularly first home buyer numbers. They are at record lows at the moment. I believe they'll continue to be at those record lows. I think it's still doable in the other capital city markets. As you said, we've got a lot of supply coming through in Melbourne and Brisbane particularly. We are starting to see a consistency in lower prices in the Brisbane market for apartments and also rising vacancy rates. So I think there's more of a rebalancing happening there in terms of affordability, but I think that almost you could say the horse has bolted in that Sydney market in terms of getting back to anywhere near average first home buyer activity in the market.
When we talk about, the dichotomy between East Coast and West Coast, is there a need? I mean, some people have called for a national housing affordability strategy to try and iron out some of those issues across the nation. Do you foresee this being a huge issue for our politicians in the year ahead, that we may see some significant changes being addressed in the economy?
Well, look, I think that obviously the supply side is important, but local economic factors are the key drivers of a balance in housing market activity. And as I said, I think that most markets are okay, except for that Sydney market. So I'm not sure we have a one-size-fits-all solution to this problem. I think eventually we will see more first home buyers in the market in most capital cities. I think Sydney is the exception. And I think that it's an exception to the point we've got to start actually accepting that we're going to see people renting for longer and more people renting in the Sydney Basin, and that we maybe need to start thinking about how we address those differences in higher levels of renting in terms of housing ownership.
And as far as the political pressure on the issue is concerned,
yes.
you feel as though that is going to increase next year when we talk about the tax treatment around
yes.
property, being it negative gearing,
yes.
capital gains, even stamp duty as a relief?
Well, look, the issue with changes to the tax mix is that it attacks it on the demand side. Now, more demand is not what we need in the Sydney market particularly, and typically if we throw differences in tax mix or first home buyer bonuses, that only adds to the price of the property down the track in the medium term, and that means that those that are coming behind those that benefit from changes to those benefits pay more. I think that we've got to look at decentralisation and other factors that can get people perhaps working in the Sydney Basin but living in regional centres. But I do think other markets have the potential to become balanced and affordable for first home buyers. And the key, of course, I think at the bottom line is the economy, and we're still struggling in the economy, particularly with low incomes growth, and that, of course, constrains savings.
All right, well, Dr. Andrew Wilson, it is going to be another busy year ahead for all of us. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew.